Critical Strike versus Critical Chance and how to potentially replace it, or at least what options are on the table. The reason I'm going to be talking about three topics in this video is strictly because every time RNG is added into the game, it brings up the discussion about is RNG even good for League of Legends, and in my opinion, it kind of depends on how it's handled, right? Like when you look at the dragons, a lot of people don't necessarily like the random spawning of the element dragons because they'd like to be able to form a comp based off of maybe knowing what the first dragon is going to be, at least something like that. They can contest it, etc, etc. But in general, it's okay for most people because it does tell you like which dragon is coming next and things like that. When you look at ARAM, for example, a lot of people have an issue with ARAM accounts because they can only just get really decent poking champions or something and kind of abuse that mode. But at the same time, it's kind of like, okay, for the most part, this is kind of like a untilt kind of game mode, a for fun kind of game mode, thing like that, so okay. And then Plants. Plants is actually pretty controversial. It's changed and it's not as controversial anymore because, you know, they kind of like close it up a bit. There used to be like maybe like 5 of each plant if I remember correctly, and now they kind of, you know, made it down to like 2 of each plant. And like the honeydew plants kind of only spawn in rivers, so even though it's random, it's kind of controlled random, etc, etc. So why are we talking about Critical Chance versus Critical Strike? Is because crit as a stat is probably one of the most hated things in this game that I can think of, especially as an AD carry player. Now granted, you would think I'd be biased and say crit is just fantastic, but honestly I can understand the frustrations against it, and this is why. Most of the champions, especially AD carries for example, that really abuse crit well, or at least just synergize with it well, they have access to it very early, but are also disgusting with it pretty late. You think of late game champions like, you know, Jinx, Tristana, Caitlyn for that matter. These are champions that build crit, and once it gets to the late game and they have 6 items, you understand they're a nightmare now. It's not that you can't beat them, it's just that you have to play differently against them then, as you might not have had to do in the earlier game when they were supposed to be weaker. And that's actually part of the problem with Critical Chance, or Crit Strike being a chance kind of stat, an RNG element to it, is that a Tristana with a Zeal item that suddenly crits 4 times in a team fight at 13 minutes at a choke point suddenly just won the team fight for her team, and it's going to now snowball into oblivion off of having a tremendous team fight potential that she should only really kind of had if this was like 30 plus minutes into the game. And that's the problem. It's not necessarily crit as a stat, it's just the fact that because it's a random element, you could have something like that happen, and suddenly you took the fight with the Tristana and her team because she's supposed to be weak this early, or the Jinx, or whatever. They're supposed to be weak at 13 minutes. They're not supposed to be all powerful yet, and yet here they are critting your face off suddenly because what the heck? It was just chance, right? And that's what I mean by Critical Chance versus Critical Strike, because crit strikes just crit as a stat. I don't agree with people that say it should be removed, because as a stat, I think you need it to be able to take down hyper tanks. That's always been my thing. When it comes to crit, I defend it because hyper tanks exist. I even tried experimenting with this with Ascension over the weekend, in which case I'd play something like Jinx, and I wouldn't build crit. I'd build like Blade of the Ruined King, Last Whisper items, lifesteal items, things like that, and guess what? Mundo, I still could not kill him because I didn't have the damage multiplier necessarily to kill him despite all the damage I had. So I do think crit is necessary if things like Blade of the Ruined King and, you know, armor penetration can't kill Mundo, right? A flat pin couldn't even kill, like certain hyper tanks when they get 6 items, that's just it. And it's not like with crit you're not going to die to a Thornmail, of course, but it is going to give you more of a chance if you save that tank for last to blow through him, because at least you'll have multiple people hitting him, and all those people that are hitting him are doing a lot of damage. That's not always the case without it, but I will say I do agree, or at least understand, with the notion that crit can be frustrating because of the example I named earlier. You took that team fight with what's supposed to be a weak character, and they're not weak because of random chance. How are you supposed to plan around that? Like, just from a planning perspective, the strategic aspect of this game, you strategically took a fight in a window when that Jinx is supposed to be weak, and she just melted your face off with crits. Like, it's not really particularly fair. That's why people don't like crit runes, for example, because you can take crit runes at the start of a game, and suddenly you get those same crits in lane, and it's just all, like I played sometimes with a full crit rune page. 20% crit. That means if you wanted to be like really risky and take like the glove first, it's like in Static Shiv or Zeal, you're gonna have 30% crit chance heading to lane at level 1. And that's not a terribly lot when your, you know, damage isn't a lot to begin with, so the crit isn't going to be multiplying your damage by a lot. But at the same time, on something like Vayne, for example, right now, especially when if her auto attack crits and you tumble, the Q will also crit and maybe do bonus damage. that can really take somebody out. Like, especially because Vayne has movement speed when she's moving towards an enemy, so you take Storm Raiders, and at level 1 you can easily get a first blood depending on how you play it. And that's part of the problem right there, is that it's random though. It's not a guaranteed, hey, I have 20%, so every 1 in 5 attacks is going to crit. It's pretty much, hey, all of these attacks could crit. All 3 autos could crit. The guaranteed crit, like with the Tumble or something on Jhin. The reason I made the page, by the way, was because something called the Hyperspeed Jhin build. You can find it on YouTube by, I can't pronounce their name correctly, but you'll know it when you see it, because this person pretty much has like 100% crit, and like things like Trinity Force and Storm Raiders. Jhin is just running all around the place after every auto attack, as if he has Jinx's passive in every auto attack. So, you know, there's that. But furthermore, getting back on topic, the thing about crit as a stat, I think it's necessary for hyper tanks, right? But it's just the RNG element that makes it a little bit difficult to play around, especially if you're a top laner, you're a tank, and you don't, you know, rush omens because maybe you didn't think it was necessary. The hyper scaling champions aren't in the mid game even yet. It's still somewhat early game or semi early game. You should be fine, and yet that's the thing. No, you're not, because you actually kind of need to just get Randuin's Omen immediately. And we can talk about Randuin's Omen briefly for a second, because it's kind of like the anti-crit tank item. That's what you're supposed to go to. But 10% just really isn't a lot to save you from a lot of these champions that are out here critting people's faces off. Like Yasuo, for example. If you really want to make the use of Omen against a crit champion, literally build just 6 Omens. And what will happen is, even though Jinx's crits can be nasty, if you build 6 Omens, her crits can do as little as like 75 damage, I believe it is. So there are ways to like combat crit, but you don't really want to build 6 random Omens item, because if you're the tank, you're probably playing against a mixed damage team, and unless Jinx is like the sole source of damage on the enemy team, like a Protect the Jinx comp or like a, you know, Juggermaw for like a crit champion, that's not really going to be any good, right? You're going to get blown up by any magic damage on the enemy team, so you need some sort of mixed kind of tank build, in which case you can't afford to build multiple Omens, most likely. Now granted, if you're an in-game tank like a Mundo or something, maybe by the time you get Thornmail and, you know, Frozen Heart and all that stuff, it might actually be enough that when the Jinx or something is auto-attacking you, she'll actually kill herself on the Thornmail, for example. So there is the potential that if you can get to be an in-game tank, it's fine, right? But when I say hyper tanks, I'm talking about things like Garen, Mundo, and maybe even Malphite, Rammus, but that's not every tank in the game. Every tank in the game doesn't necessarily have those scalings, healing potential, and like just really obnoxious annoyingness for kiting with the Frozen Heart and all that stuff. Maybe Maokai, but even then, Maokai is something that I particularly don't. He can be difficult because of CC he brings and all that, but I don't see him and go, oh crap, once we get late game, there's no way to kill him absolutely at all ever, you know what I mean? When I see a Mundo or Garen that have somehow reached the late game because you couldn't punish Garen early enough, I'm thinking, yeah, this is actually going to be pretty annoying to play against. But now let's talk about, okay, what do you do if you want to replace crit? Well, if you want to remove crit, and not just the RNG element, what if you just wanted to remove crit, period? What do you replace it with? Do you replace it with true damage? Because some people argue that's part of Vayne's problem, is that because her kit innately has the true damage built into it, it makes it very easy for her to then build some crit and then just be ridiculously powerful. And even though it's like the health percent damage, which you could maybe replace crit with that too, it depends, right? Because on squishier targets, the idea is it can't burst squishier targets because it's health percent damage. But is that really stopping Vayne from destroying the bot lanes and 3-shotting like supports? Not so much. So there is an issue there. I don't think it's completely terrible. I don't think it's a terrible like substitution. I just think there maybe are some things you might have to clean up there, because right now the only real counter to true damage is to build health. But even then, Vayne, for example, is a tank killer, so you can build all the health you want. She's still going to kill you because by design, that's what she's still going to do. So that's not really the best, I think, replacement. But I do think it's an option on the table, right? Because otherwise, it's like build a lot of like armor penetration items and build a lot of, you know, flat pin items. And like I said, my personal experience experimenting in Ascension over this weekend, that didn't really solve anything unless I had crit behind it. Like the only way I was able to kill Mundo in that particular game I talked about was once I then started building crit on top of it, because then we had, again, the damage multiplier to actually take down these carries. Because if you think about it, without crit, you might build like 300, 400 damage, but these tanks might have 4,000 or more health, so you would at least need 10 hits if they had no resistances. But because they're a tank, they have tons of resistances. They could have like 66% reduced damage. Now, out of 400, that's at least 200 damage that is negated by resistances, so it would take like 20 hits to kill a tank, and suddenly, if a team fight lasts that long, you might be a tank that does no damage, but if you have 20 auto attacks you get before you're dead, you might be able to kill a carry after all. But that's all of this video, because I kind of want to leave it a bit open so that you can have your own opinion and your own responses to this topic and add what you think could happen. Should crit just be more solid, in which case by building like 20% crit, 1 in 5 attacks crit, 50% like 1 in 2, and then 100% every, and it shouldn't be so random? Should it be and people are just complaining too much? Are there viable substitutions? So that's all for this video. Thank you for watching if you did watch this far. Life is full of a lot of kinks, so I don't know which video will be next, so until next time, take care from the Fire Good Eye FS.